On the second Saturday of April, 1905, in a camp clearing 9 miles south of Ozell, Florida, the Kittrell Naval Stores Company sold off everything it did not care to haul to fresh timber. The whole of Loper County seemed to have turned out for it. Men bid on wagons. Men bid on barrels, on grindstones, on a cast-iron cook range with one cracked lid. And along about noon, a widow in a mended gray dress raised her hand and bought the one lot in the yard nobody else would touch. A wagon heaped with 16 mules worth of worn-out harness for $3.75. Hold that picture a moment, because the county surely did. Arrie Raulerson, 44 years old, standing in the pine shade with her hand in the air, bidding her own scarce money on leather so tired the auctioneer had twice tried to skip the lot. The laughing started somewhere back by the cook range and rolled forward through the crowd the way wind rolls through wiregrass. A man called out that the mules had quit that harness, and now he could see why. Another allowed the widow had finally found a bargain even a mule wouldn't argue over. Somebody said she'd been robbed at any price above free. Arrie did not turn around. She counted her coins into the clerk's palm, borrowed a boy to help her hitch, and drove that groaning load out of the clearing past 200 grinning faces without once explaining herself. She could have explained. That was the part the county never guessed, not that day. She could have stood up on the wagon seat and told them exactly what was in that heap and what it was worth, down to the strap, because she had spent 21 years learning it in a room none of them had ever looked into. But a woman who has been invisible that long learns to save her breath. Leather doesn't listen either, her father used to say, and leather had never once disappointed her for it. Before that harness was done doing what she meant it to do, men who laughed in that clearing would be waiting their turn to take the laugh back. Getting there took 3 years, 2 failures that nearly finished her, and 1 season in the wettest woods in Florida. We'll walk every mile of it together. First, though, one small piece of business between you and me. If a story cut slow and pegged tight suits you better than the hurried kind, take a second now and subscribe. It will not cost you a cent, and it tells an old storyteller his thread is still holding. Now, to understand what Arrie Raulerson saw in a pile of mule leather, you have to go back to a little shop on the west side of the courthouse square in Ozell, 2 doors down from Rowdy's big store, where a painted sign hung for 31 years. G. Yarty Boots and Shows. Gideon Yarty was Arrie's father, a shoemaker of the old bench kind, and she was the only child he had. She came to the shop the year she turned 17, in 1878, to sweep floors and stitch linings, and she stayed until there was no shop left to stay in. Out front, where the light was good, Gideon measured feet, talked crops, and took the credit. Behind a plank partition, where the light was borrowed, his daughter did the work. She learned to close an upper so the seam lay flat as a scar healed clean. She learned to soak a sole and hammer it dents on the lapstone until it rang. She learned to peg, to drive small split maple pegs in a double row so straight that her father, a man who checked everything twice, quit checking hers the second winter. Most of Ozell never knew. Folks brought their feet to Gideon Yarty and got back boots his daughter had built from the ankle down, and they praised the old man to his face. And no customer in that store ever heard him correct the record. Maybe he should have. Maybe she should have made him. But the habit of being unseen settles on a person like dust on a shelf, so slow there is no saying what day it got thick. The one thing Gideon gave her, he gave out loud, over and over, until it wore a groove in her. Never buy leather you haven't bent against your thumb. Paper lies, he said. Salesmen lie, the grain tells it true. Bend it, and listen with your hand. Gideon died in the winter of 1899. The shop, the tools, and the goodwill sold at the courthouse steps to J.B. Rountree, who owned the big store across the square, and Rountree made the little building an annex and filled its shelves with factory shoes in pasteboard boxes, machine-sewn brogans from up north, priced at $1.40 cash. Arrie stood in the crowd that day too, watching, saying nothing. A married woman by then with a baby on her hip. She did buy back one thing out of the storeroom, for almost nothing, because Rountree had no use for it. Her father's bench and his pegging kit. Her husband was Arrie Raulerson, a hauling man, timber and cross ties for whoever was paying, and he was good in the plain, provable ways. Wages, home, wood split high, a boy named Coy who worshipped the ground his wagon rolled on. Typhoid came through the flatwoods in the wet fall of 1904 and took Lonnie in 9 days. It left Arrie a house by Sweet Gum Branch on the town's south edge, a garden, one milk cow, her father's bench under a sheet in the corner, and a boy of 10 with his father's wide feet. The county called her the mending widow. Half-soles for a quarter, a ripped seam for a dime, done while you waited. Ozell thought kindly of her, the way a town thinks kindly of a fence post. That was the whole shape of her life the morning she drove out to the Kittrell sale, meaning to bid on a shoemaker's jack somebody said was in the pile, and came home instead with 16 mules worth of harness, and the county's laughter following her wagon like crows behind a planter. Here is what the laughing men did not know. She had not bid foolish, and she had not bid blind. She had walked the yard before the crying started, the way her father used to walk a hidehouse, and she had stopped at that wagon and pulled one long strap out of the tangle and bent it against her thumb. It was a trace, one of the pair of long straps that run back from a mule's collar to the singletree, the straps that do the actual pulling. It was gray with dried sweat salt, stiff as a barrel stave, ugly as sin, and under her thumb the grain closed fine and tight and came back slow like good bread dough and did not crack. She stood there in the noise of the auction, with her hand full of proof and her heart going like a sewing machine. That evening she emptied the wagon by lantern light and sorted the heap on her porch. And it is worth a minute of our time to understand what she was sorting, because the whole story turns on it. Harness leather is not shoe leather's poor cousin. It is oak tan the slow way, cut from the back of the hide where the fiber runs densest, and then it is hot stuffed, soaked while warm with tallow and oils until the grease goes clear through the hide. It is made to live outdoors, rained on daily, hauling against a ton of pine log without tearing. And a trace is the best leather in the whole rig, because harness makers cut traces from the center of the back, knowing a trace that snaps under load can kill a man. Then the mule finishes what the tannery started. 10 years of steady pulling works that fiber tighter and tighter, the way a walked road packs harder than a graded one. What Loper County saw in Arrie's wagon was trash. What Arrie saw was the densest, most weatherproof sole leather in 3 counties, already proven by 10 years of honest work, at a price no tannery on earth could touch. Out of 16 sets she culled 28 traces sound enough to bottom boots with. The backbands, billets, and breeching she stacked in a second pile. Smooth, handsome, barely marked, the prettiest leather in the load. Remember that second pile. It is going to cost her. She was still sorting when Doss Simmons came up the path from the branch, hat in hand. Doss was 52, a chipper for the Kittrell camp, and in his younger years he had driven and doctored the very mules whose harness lay strung across the widow's porch. He looked the heap over a long while. Then he touched one strap with 2 fingers, gentle as you'd touch a sleeping dog. "That near trace, third one down," he said. "That pulled for a mule name of Dinah, 9 years, and she never once broke gait." He went through the pile that way, giving the leather its biography. Which strap had crossed the Suwannee at high water, which had hauled the boiler for the new still, which mule had died in the traces, and which had been sold south still wearing them. Then he asked the widow, respectful, what she aimed to do with it all. "Boots," Arrie said. Doss looked down at his own feet a moment. He was wearing commissary brogans 5 weeks old, split leather already drinking water at the seams, curling at the toe like old bacon. He did not laugh. In the whole of Loper County that April, he was the first one who didn't. Through the summer she built the first pair, and she built them for Coy. The boy had outgrown everything. School was coming in October, and he had Lonnie's feet, wide as a spade and still growing. She cut the uppers from the lighter billet leather and worked them soft with her hands. She cut the soles and heels from a trace that Doss said had pulled 11 years, and she pegged them on her father's bench with her father's awl, double row, 5 to the inch, and waxed the finished pair dark. They were plain and they were heavy-looking, and there was not a machine stitch anywhere on them. And when she set them on the table, she caught herself listening for her father's step behind the partition. In late August, she took Coy to the big store for school slates, and that is where the boots met the county. Wick Odom was on the porch, a shoe drummer out of Jacksonville who worked the inland towns twice a year, sample case open across a nail keg, patent leather tips catching the sun like wet watermelon seed. Odom was a man who could talk a hen out of her egg and make her feel flattered. He looked down at Coy's feet and stopped talking entirely, which for Odom was an event. "What in the nation is the boy shod with?" "Purse," Arrie said. "I cut them from harness." Odom held up one of his machine-made samples next to Coy's foot, turned to the porch, and smiled the smile that sold the shoes. "Gentlemen, look here. Trace boots. Mule wear for mule work." The porch laughed, and the name stuck before the laugh died, the way names do in a small town. J.B. Rountree did not exactly laugh. Rountree was a fair-minded man in his ledger-keeping way, and what he said straight to her, and every word of it was true. The grease in that leather would never take a blacking, he said. Her boots would always look poor next to a shined factory shoe, whatever they did or didn't do in the wet. His brogans were $1.40 cash on the shelf behind him, and the camp commissaries ran $1.55 in scrip, and if she meant to ask $2.35, she should know that a man paid on Saturday does his arithmetic with what's in his pocket, not with what lasts. And one woman at one bench could not shoe a county. "I can sell a wagon load while you peg one pair, Mrs. Raulerson," he said. "That's not spite, that's arithmetic." Hold on to how true that was. All three of those things will come back around. Coy heard the porch laugh, and he heard the name, and being 11 he carried trace boots to school with him like a stone in his sock. 3 weeks. That is how long the first pair lasted before it shamed them both. Mid-September, on the schoolhouse steps, in front of the entire yard, the sole of Coy's right boot let go and flapped open at the toe. Stop there a second and stand where he stood, the morning bell not yet rung. 40 children on the steps and the dirt, the flap of leather hanging like a turtle's jaw, and one beat of perfect quiet before a big boy in the back hollered, "Trace boots!" And the whole yard took it up in a chant. Coy walked the 2 miles home that afternoon barefoot, boots tied over his shoulder, rather than let the county hear him flap. At the bench that night, Arrie found 4 pegs gone from the right sole, and 3 working loose in the left, and she sat with the wreck of her work in her lap, and made herself think like her father instead of like a mother. She had pegged that sole the same as 1,000 soles before it. So the fault was not in her hand. The fault was in something she did not yet know. Understand first why she pegged at all. Because it matters in wet country. A sewn sole is held by waxed linen thread and thread wicks water. And in the flatwoods, where a road can stand ankle-deep from June to Christmas, wet thread rots in a season and the sole quietly lets go. A maple peg is different. Wood swells when it drinks. A pegged sole in standing water grips tighter the wetter it gets, which is why the old swamp country makers pegged everything and trusted no stitch below the ankle. Pegs were the right answer. But a peg holds by friction. Wood-biting leather and hot-stuffed harness leather is full of grease from the surface to the core, that grease being the very thing that makes it shed water. Every peg hole she had driven was slicked from the inside. The pegs had not broken. They had backed out as the boy walked one by one, easy as nails pulled from soap. Her father's rules were 40 years of truth about clean, dry sole bends. Nobody had ever taught him greasy leather, so nobody had ever taught her, and she sat at his bench that night, on the far side of everything he knew, alone, with a laughed-at boy asleep in the next room. It took her most of the fall to work out the answer, ruining scraps by lamplight after the mending was done. Killing the grease outright would kill the waterproofing with it. Boil the virtue out of the leather to save the seam, and she'd have nothing left worth pegging. What she wanted was a dry seam through a greasy sole. So she learned to score the peg line, just the peg line, and swab it with potash lye water, again and again, until that one narrow strip went pale and hungry, while the rest of the sole stayed fat with tallow. Then her pegs went into leather that could bite. She rebuilt Coy's pair in November. He would not wear them to school, and she did not make him. He wore them to the woodpile and down to the branch and back all winter, through mud that pulled at every step, and the soles held as if they had grown there. Come spring of 1906, she was ready to prove the boots on a working man, and the man was Doss Simmons. His commissary brogans quit him about every 6 weeks in wet weather, and a chipper lives on his feet or he doesn't live. Doss had no cash. Kittrell paid in scrip, so she made him a trial pair for nothing but the news they would carry back into the woods. And here is where the second pile on the porch collected its debt. Doss's feet were broad as bream, and wanting width under him, she cut his soles not from her narrow traces, but from the back bands. Those wide, smooth, handsome straps barely marked the leather that looked like the best of the whole load. 6 weeks into the season, he came up the path holding the boots in both hands, careful, apologizing as though he had broken a borrowed thing. "I get more step out of these than any shoe I ever owned," he said. But they wore through at the ball, both feet the same. She bent the worn sole double against her thumb, and this time the grain told a different truth. Smooth on the face, soft in the heart. And Doss, turning a backband scrap over in his hands, said the sentence that finished her education better than any bench year had. "Well," he said, "a backband never pulled a pound in its life. It just lays across the mule and looks fit." "That was the whole of it," said Plain. The handsome leather was handsome because it had never worked. It rode along on the mule's back, sun on top and sweat underneath, stretching hollow-hearted under a smooth face, while the ugly gray traces took the load year after year and got denser for it. She had known that with her thumb at the auction and forgotten it at the bench. The first time looks argued with proof. She never forgot it again, and she never again cut a sole from anything that had not pulled. She rebuilt Doss's pair from the two widest traces in the pile, pegged down the dry line, and he wore them into the wet months of 1906, and they held. By midsummer, every hand on his drift had turned those boots over at the noon fire, and word ran through the camp quarters faster than word had ever run through town. Men began finding their way to her porch on Sundays, hats off, asking her price. $2.35, she told them, cash. And right there, the whole enterprise stopped like a wheel in deep sand. Kittrell paid its hands in scrip, good at the commissary and nopless else on earth. The commissary stocked $1.55 brogans by the crate. The men who wanted her boots the most, the men whose feet were their wages, held pay she could not accept for leather they could not buy. She had the right hide, at last, the right seam, the right boot, and not one customer with $1 to his name. And away south over the Gulf, though nobody in Ozell yet knew to watch for it, the wettest year anybody in Loper County would ever measure was already building. The winter of 1906 going into 1907 was the winter of almost. She had the boot, she had the proof on one man's feet. What she had was a bench, a method, and a wall of scrip she could not climb, and she spent those months mending the town's shoes for dimes, while the answer to everything sat oiled and finished on a porch shelf. Two things happened in that stretch, and both of them mattered more than they looked. The first was Hamp Tillett. Tillett was the Kittrell Woods rider, the man on horseback who covered every drift in the operation, checking streaks, counting faces, settling small disputes before they got large. A woods rider is paid partly in cash, and a man who sits a saddle through Florida rain thinks hard about his feet even so. In December, he rode up to the house on Sweetgum Branch, stepped down, and bought a pair across the porch rail. $2.35, counted into her hand, the first full-price cash sale of her life. He turned the boots over twice, looked at the pegging the way he looked at a clean streak, and said 4 words. "Who taught you this?" She thought about the answer longer than the question deserved. "A wall," she said finally, and Tillett, who did not understand and did not press, tipped his hat and rode off wearing her work. The second thing was smaller and stranger. In February, Doss Simmons stopped by the porch with a sack of cane syrup in trade for peg repairs, and stood a while looking south, in the manner of a man reading something. The shallow gallberry ponds out on the flats had stood brim full since Christmas, he said, and that morning he had heard a rain crow calling away off in the hammock. In February, mind, months before its season. Doss had spent 52 years under that particular sky. "Wet year coming," he said. "Wettest kind." He said it the way another man might report a price. Arrie said nothing back because there was nothing decent to say. But the plain fact is that a wet year is the one judge a cheap boot cannot argue with. And the woods were fixing to run, free of charge, the very test she had no money to stage. If you have ever had to wait on weather, you know exactly how long that spring was. Chipping started the second week of March. Now, to follow what happened next, you need the shape of a chipper's year in your head. So let me lay it out plain, because there is no story without it. A turpentine crop in those days was 10,500 faces, 10,500 cut streaks on 10,500 pines, and one chipper tended one crop, every face freshened every week, week on week, from first sap to first frost. Nobody rode. A chipper walked his drift, hack swinging, through wiregrass and gallberry and standing water, 6 days out of 7. Call it 10 miles, and better a day when the walking was honest, and worse than that when it wasn't. His pay came as scrip on the company books, spent at the company commissary, and the commissary sold what it chose at the price it chose. That was the whole economy of the Pines, closed as a fruit jar. A man's feet carried every dollar he would ever make, and the boots on those feet came off a crate stack, split leather, machine sewn, $1.55, made 800 miles north by men who would never once stand in June water to the boot top. The rain crow had told it true. The rain set in early that June and then forgot how to quit. July drowned. August stood water on the low drifts from one Sunday to the next, and men chipped their streaks walking in it, because gum does not wait on comfort. And out on that drowned ground, quiet as arithmetic, the county's two kinds of leather went to trial against each other. The commissary sold clean out of brogans in July and again before September, crate after crate, seams wicking, thread rotting, soles letting go in the wet same as they always had, only faster. Put one face on it, so the season isn't just weather. Ance Paget chipped the drift neighboring Doss's. A young man, quick with a hack, feeding a wife and a baby out of a script book. His second pair of brogans that year died under him on a Tuesday in August, the sole peeling loose in standing water, a 4-hour walk from anywhere, and Ansi did what a man on task does. He stepped out of the wreck of them and finished his week barefoot in the palmetto flats. Palmetto stobs cut like broken crockery. By Saturday he could not lace what was left of anything, and he lay up 3 days while his faces went shaggy. And every one of those unchipped streaks went into Tillett's tally book as gum that never made the barrel. He came to Arrie's porch in September, hat in hand, and stood there with no cash and no way around having none, and that visit stayed with her longer than the laughing ever had. She had built the answer to that man's exact trouble, and the script wall stood between them the same as ever. All she could do that day was fit him and write his measurements in her book against a better arrangement. And watching him walk back toward the quarters, she understood, clear as a bell rung once, that the wall was never going to be climbed one pair at a time. Somebody with the ledger had to want it down. Meanwhile, Doss Simmons walked his crop, streak by streak, week by week, in the one pair of trace leather boots Arrie Raulerson had built him back in the spring of 1906, greasing them with tallow of a Sunday, and keeping the peg line dry the way she'd shown him, and they did not quit. Not in July, not in the August water, not by first frost. The count happened in November, and I want you to see it, because no test this channel has ever told was settled with less ceremony. Frost had shut the sap down. Dip was done, the last barrels headed for the still, and the hands stood in line at the commissary squaring the season's books. Tillett was at the counter with the ledger, and Doss came up in those boots, 17 months old now and dark as a skillet, and some clerk or other made a joke about mule wear that nobody bothered to laugh at anymore. Tillett looked down at the boots a moment. Then he took up his pencil stub and did a Woods Rider's figuring right there on the back of a paper sack. 35 weeks of season, 6 days to the week, 10 miles and better to the day. He wrote the number and turned the sack around so the counter could read it. 2,240 miles, give or take the Sundays. Then he ran his finger down the ledger to the season before, where Doss Simmons stood charged for 5 pairs of brogans at $1.55, $7.75 of dyeing leather, and this season for none. He laid the pencil down on the sack. 1 pair, Tillett said. That was the whole of the speech. No committee heard it. No paper printed it. The number sat on a paper sack, on a commissary counter, 9 miles out in the pines, in front of maybe a dozen tired men. And it was enough, because those dozen men owned 24 feet, and every one of those feet had spent the wet year learning the same lesson the hard way. What happened next did not happen in town. It moved the other way, out of the woods inward, on foot. Within the month, hands at the pay window were asking the commissary clerk could he get trace boots, asking with the drummer's own sneer worn clean off the words, the way a creek wears a bottle smooth, and the clerk, needing to write the request down somehow, wrote it the only way there was to write it. Trace boots went into a company order book that November in a clerk's tired hand, and an insult became a line of inventory, and no one present thought the moment worth remarking on. That is how it usually goes with vindication, whatever the storybooks say. The bells mostly stay quiet. The ledgers do the singing. One more small thing happened that December, and in the ledger of this story, it outweighs the telegram to come. On a frost morning, Coy, 13 that fall, and grown 2 sizes since the schoolhouse steps, took his rebuilt pair down off the porch shelf where they had sat through a year of woodpile duty, and wore them to school. Nobody told him to. Nobody chanted. Somewhere out in the pines the name had turned over, and names turn over in a schoolyard faster than anywhere on earth, and before the bell a big boy, the same big boy if you want to know, asked him where a fellow could get a pair made. Arrie heard about it secondhand, from the boy least likely to tell her, which is to say she pieced it together from what Coy didn't say at supper, and the particular way he set his boots by the door that night, toes out like his father used to. She went out on the porch after he was asleep, and stood a while in the cold. Some accounts a mother keeps. She keeps nowhere you could audit. Rountree came to her in December. Give the man his due. He came himself, across the square and down the branch road, and he stood at her porch with his hat in his hand and went back through his own 3 objections like a merchant, auditing his own books, out loud, in order. The blacking, first. Her boots still would not shine, he said, and they still looked poor next to a factory shoe in a window, and the county had quit caring, which was a thing he had not believed he would live to see. The arithmetic, second. $1.40 against $2.35 had been his whole case, and the paper sack out at the commissary had redone that arithmetic over a full season, and his side of it had lost by better than $5 a man. And third, and here he looked at her steadily, one woman at one bench still could not shoe a county. That objection stood, which was, he said, the reason he had walked down. Bring me what pairs you can spare, Rountree said. Cash on delivery, and your mark struck in the soul. Your mark, not my label. Folks are asking whose they are. They ought to be able to read the answer. She filed her stamp that same week out of an old buckle tongue, a small ring with a bar through it, a singletree, seen end on, the very piece of a rig the traces pull against. And so, at 46 years old, 29 years after she first sat down behind her father's partition, Arrie Raulerson's own mark went into leather for the first time in her life. She stamped the first pair for Rountree's shelf. Then she sat a long minute with her thumb over the little ring, and if you want to know what she was thinking, so do I. Some rooms in a person stay shut, and a storyteller worth his salt knocks and then leaves them be. Then January of 1908 came, and with it the 2 letters in the same week that made her choose. The first was carried, not mailed, till it rode in with a camp order signed by the operator himself. 40 pairs for the commissary shelf, cash money at her full price, with more behind it if the first lot moved, and the operator's reasoning was pure Pinewoods economics, no sentiment in it anywhere. His tally book held the cost of the wet year in black figures, crates of dead brogans, and dearer than the brogans the laid-up days. Aunts Paget's 3 among them, when hands sat healing while their faces went shaggy. The arithmetic was short. A man off his feet was gum out of the barrel, and gum out of the barrel cost more than good leather ever would. The second letter was from Rountree, and it was the one she had been waiting 9 years to receive. He was putting a brick addition on the big store. He needed money to do it, and he would sell her the old Yerty building, her father's shop, signhook still in the brick, for $150. She had $148 saved. 9 years of quarters and dimes in a lard tin, saved for exactly and only that door. Understand what the camp order actually asked of her. 28 traces had come off that auction wagon, and the better part of them were already walking around Loper County under other men's feet. 40 pairs meant leather she did not have, and the whole worth of her method lived in leather that had pulled. So the order meant buying worked harness, lots of it, wherever mules had worn it out. The 2 camps south of the river, the sawmill barns, the liveries in 3 towns, freight paid, cash down. It meant pegs by the barrel and a second lapstone, and it meant hiring the one man in Florida who could look at a strap and tell her its working life to the year. Doss Simmons turned 54 that winter, with his knees telling him about every one of those 2,000 miles, and she paid him a wage to ride the camps buying leather by feel. The first money his knowledge had ever earned that his feet didn't carry. Added up any way she tried, the order took the lard tin, all of it, and the shop money was the order money. There was no arranging it otherwise. She walked into town on a Thursday and stood a while at the annex window, looking through the glass at the pasteboard boxes, stacked where her father's bench used to sit, close enough that her breath fogged the pane. The light inside was the same borrowed light she had worked in for 21 years, falling the same way across a floor that still showed, if you knew where to look, the 4 pale scars where the bench feet had stood. She put her bare palm flat against the brick beside the door, on the 2 rusted hooks that had carried her father's sign. The brick was cold under her hand. She stood there long enough for a passing woman to ask, was she well? You could buy back the room, she told herself, or you could buy what the room was for. Her father had owned that room for 31 years. and the county had never once looked past him into it. She had owned no room at all, and the pines were full of men who knew her mark by heart. Then she walked across the square, told Rountree to build his addition with somebody else's money, and spent $141 of her $148 on wore-out harness, freight, pegs, and a leather buyer's wages. The yurty building never was hers again. Rountree sold it in the end to a man who put a barber chair in it. She kept the bench on the back porch by Sweet Gum Branch her whole working life. And if the county thought it strange that the best-known bootmaker in the Pines had no shopfront on any square, the Woods never thought about it at all. The Woods didn't buy the room. The Woods bought the boots. Wick Odom worked back through Ozell in the spring of 1908, and being a drummer to the bone, he did the one intelligent thing his trade allowed. He drove down the branch road, set his hat on his knee, and offered to place her line with a Jacksonville jobbing house. City label, city volume, her method, and somebody else's name on the box. She thanked him for the ride out and told him the mark went where the work went, or the work went nowhere, and Odom, who had coined the name Trace Boots as a joke on that very Porch's account, wrote nothing in his order book and made no jokes at all. He sold no brogans in Ozell that trip. Some men you have to ruin. Others can read a paper sack same as anybody. The Kittrell operation cut out its second tract in the fall of 1909 and moved 70 miles southwest, the way camps did, following the timber. The mules went, the men went, and that November a wire came up from the new camp's commissary to the Ozell depot, asking freight rates, and the clerk who took it down read the order twice to be sure he had it right. Because there between the shipping talk sat two words that had been coined on a store porch 4 years earlier as a joke at a widow's expense, now spelled out plain in a company telegram with money behind them. Trace Boots. The name had walked 70 miles and gotten there before she did. By 1912, Coy was 18 and cutting soles at her right hand. He had come to the bench on his own the winter he was 15, and she had let him find his own way to it, having learned from her father's shop exactly how not to keep an heir. Her singletree mark was walking drifts in camps she would never lay eyes on, under men she would never meet, and now and then a stranger's letter reached her by rural carrier, asking after sizes, and she answered everyone in a careful hand at the kitchen table after supper. I have thought a long while about why her boots held when the crate stacks kept dying, and the plainest answer is the truest one. Every ounce of leather under those men's feet had already pulled a load for 10 years before she ever touched it. She trusted worked things because she had spent her whole life being one, and the first people to see her clearly were the very people the county itself never looked at. Hands 9 miles out in the drowned pines, reading her work the one-way work can honestly be read, with their own bodies, mile upon mile upon mile. The town's laughter simply ran out of anywhere to stand. The people in this story are inventions of mine, and so is Loper County, but the leather, the pegs, the scrip, the rain, and the miles are as true as I could cut them. If you sat with me clear to the end of this one, I'd count it a kindness to hear from you. Tell me in the comments what worn-out thing your own family knew better than to throw away. Every town had one, and I read every word you all leave. If the story wore well on you, pass it to somebody with a long memory, and subscribe if you haven't, so the next one can find you easy. Till then, mind the wet, feed your leather, and keep your own peg line dry.